The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. Part 4. Chapter 16. Richmond. A few minutes later she was sitting, wrapped in costly furs, near Sir Percy Blakeney on the box seat of his magnificent coach, and the four splendid bays had thundered down the quiet street. The night was warm in spite of the gentle breeze which fanned Marguerite's burning cheeks. Soon London houses were left behind, and rattling over old Hammersmith Bridge, Sir Percy was driving his bays rapidly towards Richmond. The river wound in and out in its pretty delicate curves, looking like a silver serpent beneath the glittering rays of the moon. Long shadows from overhanging trees spread occasional deep palls right across the road. The bays were rushing along at breakneck speed, held but slightly back by Sir Percy's strong, unerring hands. These nightly drives after balls and suppers in London were a source of perpetual delight to Marguerite, and she appreciated her husband's eccentricity keenly, which caused him to adopt this mode of taking her home every night, to their beautiful home by the river, instead of living in a stuffy London house. He loved driving his spirited horses along the lonely, moonlit roads, and she loved to sit on the box seat, with the soft air of an English late summer's night, fanning her face after the hot atmosphere of a ball or supper party. The drive was not a long one, less than an hour, sometimes when the bays were very fresh, and Sir Percy gave them full rein. Tonight, he seemed to have a very devil in his fingers, and the coach seemed to fly along the road beside the river. As usual, he did not speak to her, but stared straight in front of him, the ribbon seeming to lie quite loosely in his slender, white hands. Marguerite looked at him tentatively once or twice. She could see his handsome profile and one lazy eye, with its straight fine brow and drooping heavy lid. The face in the moonlight looked singularly earnest, and recalled to Marguerite's aching heart those happy days of courtship before he had become the lazy nincompoop, the effete fop, whose life seemed spent in card and supper rooms. But now, in the moonlight, she could not catch the expression of the lazy blue eyes. She could only see the outline of the firm chin, the corner of the strong mouth, the well-cut massive shape of the forehead. Truly, nature had meant well by Sir Percy. His faults must all be laid at the door of that poor, half-crazy mother, and of the distracted, heartbroken father, neither of whom had cared for the young life which was sprouting up between them, and which, perhaps, their very carelessness was already beginning to wreck. Marguerite suddenly felt intense sympathy for her husband. The moral crisis she had just gone through made her feel indulgent towards the faults, the delinquencies of others. How thoroughly a human being can be buffeted and overmastered by fate had been borne in upon her with appalling force. Had anyone told her a week ago that she would stoop to spy upon her friends, that she would betray a brave and unsuspecting man into the hands of a relentless enemy, she would have laughed the idea to scorn. Yet she had done these things. Anon, perhaps the death of that brave man would be at her door, just as 2 years ago the Marquis de St. Cyr had perished through a thoughtless word of hers. But in that case she was morally innocent. She had meant no serious harm. Fate merely had stepped in. But this time she had done a thing that obviously was base, had done it deliberately for a motive which perhaps high moralists would not even appreciate. And as she felt her husband's strong arm beside her, she also felt how much more he would dislike and despise her if he knew of this night's work. Thus human beings judge of one another, superficially, casually, throwing contempt on one another with but little reason and no charity. She despised her husband for his inanities and vulgar, unintellectual occupations, and he, she felt, would despise her still worse, because she had not been strong enough to do right for right's sake and to sacrifice her brother to the dictates of her conscience. Buried in her thoughts, Marguerite had found this hour in the breezy summer night all too brief, and it was with a feeling of keen disappointment that she suddenly realized that the bays had turned into the massive gates of her beautiful English home. Sir Percy Blakeney's house on the river has become a historic one. Palatial in its dimensions, it stands in the midst of exquisitely laid-out gardens, with a picturesque terrace and frontage to the river. Built in Tudor days, the old red brick of the walls looks eminently picturesque in the midst of a bower of green. The beautiful lawn, with its old sundial, adding the true note of harmony to its foreground. Great secular trees lent cool shadows to the grounds, and now, on this warm, early autumn night, the leaves slightly turned to russets and gold, the old garden looked singularly poetic and peaceful in the moonlight. With unerring precision, Sir Percy had brought the four bays to a standstill immediately in front of the fine Elizabethan entrance hall. In spite of the lateness of the hour, an army of grooms seemed to have emerged from the very ground, as the coach had thundered up and were standing respectfully round. Sir Percy jumped down quickly, then helped Marguerite to alight. She lingered outside for a moment, whilst he gave a few orders to one of his men. She skirted the house and stepped onto the lawn, looking out dreamily into the silvery landscape. Nature seemed exquisitely at peace, in comparison with the tumultuous emotions she had gone through. She could faintly hear the ripple of the river and the occasional soft and ghost-like fall of a dead leaf from a tree. All else was quiet round her. She had heard the horses prancing as they were being led away to their distant stables, the hurrying of servants' feet as they had all gone within to rest. The house also was quite still. In two separate suites of apartments, just above the magnificent reception rooms, lights were still burning. They were her rooms and his, well divided from each other by the whole width of the house, as far apart as their own lives had become. Involuntarily she sighed. At that moment she could really not have told why. She was suffering from unconquerable heartache. Deeply and achingly she was sorry for herself. Never had she felt so pitiably lonely, so bitterly in want of comfort and of sympathy. With another sigh, she turned away from the river towards the house, vaguely wondering if, after such a night, she could ever find rest and sleep. Suddenly, before she reached the terrace, she heard a firm step upon the crisp gravel, and the next moment her husband's figure emerged out of the shadow. He, too, had skirted the house and was wandering along the lawn towards the river. He still wore his heavy driving coat with the numerous lapels and collars he himself had set in fashion, but he had thrown it well back, burying his hands, as was his wont, in the deep pockets of his satin breeches. The gorgeous white costume he had worn at Lord Grenville's ball, with its jabot of priceless lace, looked strangely ghostly against the dark background of the house. He apparently did not notice her, for after a few moments' pause, he presently turned back towards the house and walked straight up to the terrace. "Sir Percy!" He already had one foot on the lowest of the terrace steps, but at her voice he started and paused, then looked searchingly into the shadows when she had called to him. She came forward quickly into the moonlight, and as soon as he saw her, he said, with that air of consummate gallantry he always wore when speaking to her, "At your service, madam." But his foot was still on the step, and in his whole attitude there was a remote suggestion, distinctly visible to her, that he wished to go and had no desire for a midnight interview. "The air is deliciously cool," she said, "the moonlight peaceful and poetic, and the garden inviting. Will you not stay in it a while? The hour is not yet late. Or is my company so distasteful to you that you are in a hurry to rid yourself of it?" "Nay, madam," he rejoined placidly, "but 'tis on the other foot the shoe happens to be, and I'll warrant you'll find the midnight air more poetic without my company. No doubt the sooner I remove the obstruction the better your ladyship will like it." He turned once more to go. "I protest you mistake me, Sir Percy," she said hurriedly, and drawing a little closer to him. "The estrangement, which, alas, has arisen between us, was none of my making, remember." "Begad! You must pardon me there, madam," he protested coldly. "My memory was always of the shortest." He looked her straight in the eyes, with that lazy nonchalance which had become second nature to him. She returned his gaze for a moment, then her eyes softened, as she came up quite close to him, to the foot of the terrace steps. "Of the shortest, Sir Percy? Faith! How it must have altered! Was it 3 years ago, or 4 that you saw me for 1 hour in Paris, on your way to the East? When you came back 2 years later you had not forgotten me." She looked divinely pretty as she stood there in the moonlight, with the fur cloak sliding off her beautiful shoulders, the gold embroidery on her dress shimmering around her, her childlike blue eyes turned up fully at him. He stood for a moment, rigid and still, but for the clenching of his hand against the stone balustrade of the terrace. "You desired my presence, madam," he said frigidly. I take it that it was not with a view to indulging in tender reminiscences. His voice certainly was cold and uncompromising. His attitude before her, stiff and unbending. Womanly decorum would have suggested that Marguerite should return coldness for coldness, and should sweep past him without another word, only with a curt nod of the head. But womanly instinct suggested that she should remain. That keen instinct, which makes a beautiful woman conscious of her powers long to bring to her knees the one man who pays her no homage. She stretched out her hand to him. Nay, Sir Percy, why not? The present is not so glorious, but that I should not wish to dwell a little in the past. He bent his tall figure, and taking hold of the extreme tip of the fingers which she still held out to him, he kissed them ceremoniously. "I' faith, madam," he said, "then you will pardon me if my dull wits cannot accompany you there." Once again he attempted to go. Once more her voice, sweet, childlike, almost tender, called him back. "Sir Percy, your servant, madam." "Is it possible that love can die?" she said with sudden, unreasoning vehemence. "Methought that the passion which you once felt for me would outlast the span of human life. Is there nothing left of that love, Percy, which might help you to bridge over that sad estrangement?" His massive figure seemed, while she spoke thus to him, to stiffen still more. The strong mouth hardened. A look of relentless obstinacy crept into the habitually lazy blue eyes. "With what object, I pray you, madam?" he asked coldly. "I do not understand you." "Yet 'tis simple enough," he said with sudden bitterness, which seemed literally to surge through his words, though he was making visible efforts to suppress it. "I humbly put the question to you, for my slow wits are unable to grasp the cause of this, your ladyship's sudden new mood. Is it that you have a taste to renew the devilish sport which you played so successfully last year? Do you wish to see me once more a lovesick suppliant at your feet, so that you might again have the pleasure of kicking me aside, like a troublesome lapdog's?" She had succeeded in rousing him for the moment, and again she looked straight at him, for it was thus she remembered him a year ago. "Percy, I entreat you," she whispered, "can we not bury the past?" "Pardon me, madam, but I understood you to say that your desire was to dwell in it." "Nay, I spoke not of that past, Percy," she said, while a tone of tenderness crept into her voice. "Rather did I speak of the time when you loved me still. And I was vain and frivolous. Your wealth and position allured me. I married you, hoping in my heart that your great love for me would beget in me a love for you. But alas!" The moon had sunk low down behind a bank of clouds. In the east a soft gray light was beginning to chase away the heavy mantle of the night. He could only see her graceful outline now, the small queenly head, with its wealth of reddish golden curls, and the glittering gems forming the small, star-shaped, red flower which she wore as a diadem in her hair. 24 hours after our marriage, madam, the Marquis de St. Cyr and all his family perished on the guillotine, and the popular rumor reached me that it was the wife of Sir Percy Blakeney who helped to send them there. Nay, I myself told you the truth of that odious tale, not till after it had been recounted to me by strangers, with all its horrible details. "And you believed them then and there," she said with great vehemence, without a proof or question. "You believed that I, whom you vowed you loved more than life, whom you professed you worshipped, that I could do a thing so base as these strangers chose to recount. You thought I meant to deceive you about it all, that I ought to have spoken before I married you. Yet had you listened, I would have told you that up to the very morning on which St. Cyr went to the guillotine, I was straining every nerve, using every influence I possessed to save him and his family. But my pride sealed my lips when your love seemed to perish, as if under the knife of that same guillotine. Yet I would have told you how I was duped. I, whom that same popular rumor had endowed with the sharpest wits in France. I was tricked into doing this thing by men who knew how to play upon my love for an only brother and my desire for revenge. Was it unnatural? Her voice became choked with tears. She paused for a moment or two, trying to regain some sort of composure. She looked appealingly at him, almost as if he were her judge. He had allowed her to speak on in her own vehement, impassioned way, offering no comment, no word of sympathy. And now, while she paused, trying to swallow down the hot tears that gushed to her eyes, he waited impassive and still. The dim, gray light of early dawn seemed to make his tall form look taller and more rigid. The lazy, good-natured face looked strangely altered. Marguerite, excited as she was, could see that the eyes were no longer languid, the mouth no longer good-humored and inane. A curious look of intense passion seemed to glow from beneath his drooping lids. The mouth was tightly closed, the lips compressed, as if the will alone held that surging passion in check. Marguerite Blakeney was, above all, a woman, with all a woman's fascinating foibles, all a woman's most lovable sins. She knew in a moment that for the past few months she had been mistaken, that this man who stood here before her, cold as a statue, when her musical voice struck upon his ear, loved her as he had loved her a year ago, that his passion might have been dormant, but that it was there, as strong, as intense, as overwhelming, as when first her lips met his in one long, maddening kiss. Pride had kept him from her, and, womanlike, she meant to win back that conquest which had been hers before. Suddenly it seemed to her that the only happiness life could ever hold for her again would be in feeling that man's kiss once more upon her lips. "Listen to the tale, Sir Percy," she said, and her voice now was low, sweet, infinitely tender. "Armand was all in all to me. We had no parents and brought one another up. He was my little father, and I, his tiny mother. We loved one another so. Then one day, do you mind me, Sir Percy? The Marquis de St. Cyr had my brother Armand thrashed by his lackeys. That brother whom I loved better than all the world. And his offense? That he, a plebeian, had dared to love the daughter of the aristocrat. For that he was waylaid and thrashed like a dog within an inch of his life. Oh, how I suffered! His humiliation had eaten into my very soul. When the opportunity occurred, and I was able to take my revenge, I took it, but I only thought to bring that proud marquis to trouble and humiliation. He plotted with Austria against his own country. Chance gave me knowledge of this. I spoke of it, but I did not know. How could I guess? They trapped and duped me. When I realized what I had done, it was too late. It is perhaps a little difficult, madam, said Sir Percy, after a moment of silence between them, to go back over the past. I have confessed to you that my memory is short, but the thought certainly lingered in my mind that, at the time of the Marquis' death, I entreated you for an explanation of those same noisome popular rumors. If that same memory does not, even now, play me a trick, I fancy that you refused me all explanation then, and demanded of my love a humiliating allegiance it was not prepared to give. I wished to test your love for me, and it did not bear the test. You used to tell me that you drew the very breath of life, but for me, and for love of me. And to probe that love, you demanded that I should forfeit mine honor, he said, whilst gradually his impassiveness seemed to leave him, his rigidity to relax, that I should accept without murmur or question, as a dumb and submissive slave, every action of my mistress. My heart overflowing with love and passion, I asked for no explanation. I waited for one, not doubting, only hoping. Had you spoken but one word, from you I would have accepted any explanation and believed it. But you left me without a word, beyond a bald confession of the actual horrible facts. Proudly you returned to your brother's house, and left me alone, for weeks, not knowing now, in whom to believe, since the shrine, which contained my one illusion, lay shattered to earth at my feet. She need not complain now that he was cold and impassive. His very voice shook with an intensity of passion, which he was making superhuman efforts to keep in check. The madness of my pride, she said sadly. Hardly had I gone, already I had repented. But when I returned, I found you, oh, so altered, wearing already that mask of somnolent indifference which you have never laid aside until now. She was so close to him that her soft, loose hair was wafted against his cheek. Her eyes, glowing with tears, maddened him. The music in her voice sent fire through his veins. But he would not yield to the magic charm of this woman whom he had so deeply loved and at whose hands his pride had suffered so bitterly. He closed his eyes to shut out the dainty vision of that sweet face, of that snow-white neck and graceful figure, round which the faint rosy light of dawn was just beginning to hover playfully. "Nay, madam, it is no mask," he said icily. "I swore to you once that my life was yours. For months now it has been your plaything. It has served its purpose." But now she knew that that very coldness was a mask. The trouble, the sorrow she had gone through last night, suddenly came back to her mind, but no longer with bitterness, rather with a feeling that this man who loved her would help her to bear the burden. "Sir Percy," she said impulsively, "Heaven knows you have been at pains to make the task, which I had set to myself, terribly difficult to accomplish. You spoke of my mood just now. Well, we will call it that if you will. I wish to speak to you because I was in trouble and had need of your sympathy." "It is yours to command, madam." "How cold you are," she sighed. "Faith, I can scarce believe that, but a few months ago one tear in my eye had set you well nigh crazy. Now I come to you with a half-broken heart, and I pray you, madam," he said, whilst his voice shook almost as much as hers, "in what way can I serve you?" "Percy, Armand is in deadly danger." A letter of his, rash, impetuous, as were all his actions, and written to Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, has fallen into the hands of a fanatic. Armand is hopelessly compromised. Tomorrow, perhaps he will be arrested, after that the guillotine, unless, oh, it is horrible, she said, with a sudden wail of anguish, as all the events of the past night came rushing back to her mind. "Horrible. And you do not understand. You cannot. And I have no one to whom I can turn, for help, or even for sympathy." Tears now refused to be held back. All her trouble, her struggles, the awful uncertainty of Armand's fate overwhelmed her. She tottered, ready to fall, and leaning against the stone balustrade, she buried her face in her hands and sobbed bitterly. At first mention of Armand St. Just's name and of the peril in which he stood, Sir Percy's face had become a shade more pale, and the look of determination and obstinacy appeared more marked than ever between his eyes. However, he said nothing for the moment, but watched her as her delicate frame was shaken with sobs, watched her until unconsciously his face softened, and what looked almost like tears seemed to glisten in his eyes. "And so," he said with bitter sarcasm, "the murderous dog of the Revolution is turning upon the very hands that fed it. Begad, madam," he added very gently, as Marguerite continued to sob hysterically, "will you dry your tears? I never could bear to see a pretty woman cry, and I—" Instinctively, with sudden, overmastering passion, at sight of her helplessness and of her grief, he stretched out his arms, and the next would have seized her and held her to him, protected from every evil with his very life, his very heart's blood. But pride had the better of it in this struggle once again. He restrained himself with a tremendous effort of will, and said coldly, though still very gently, "Will you not turn to me, madam, and tell me in what way I may have the honor to serve you?" She made a violent effort to control herself, and turning her tear-stained face to him, she once more held out her hand, which he kissed with the same punctilious gallantry. But Marguerite's fingers, this time, lingered in his hand for a second or two longer than was absolutely necessary, and this was because she had felt that his hand trembled perceptibly and was burning hot, whilst his lips felt as cold as marble. "Can you do aught for Armand?" she said sweetly and simply. "You have so much influence at court, so many friends." "Nay, madam, should you not rather seek the influence of your French friend, M. Chauvelin? His extends, if I mistake not, even as far as the Republican government of France. I cannot ask him, Percy. Oh, I wish I dared to tell you, but he has put a price on my brother's head which—" She would have given worlds if she had felt the courage then to tell him everything, all she had done that night, how she had suffered and how her hand had been forced. But she dared not give way to that impulse, not now, when she was just beginning to feel that he still loved her, when she hoped that she could win him back. She dared not make another confession to him. After all, he might not understand. He might not sympathize with her struggles and temptation. His love still dormant might sleep the sleep of death. Perhaps he divined what was passing in her mind. His whole attitude was one of intense longing, a veritable prayer for that confidence, which her foolish pride withheld from him. When she remained silent, he sighed, and said with marked coldness, "Faith, madam, since it distresses you, we will not speak of it. As for Armand, I pray you have no fear. I pledge you my word that he shall be safe. Now, have I your permission to go? The hour is getting late, and you will at least accept my gratitude," she said, as she drew quite close to him, and speaking with real tenderness. With a quick, almost involuntary effort, he would have taken her then in his arms, for her eyes were swimming in tears, which he longed to kiss away. But she had lured him once, just like this, then cast him aside like an ill-fitting glove. He thought this was but a mood, a caprice, and he was too proud to lend himself to it once again. "It is too soon, madam," he said quietly. "I have done nothing as yet. The hour is late, and you must be fatigued. Your women will be waiting for you upstairs." He stood aside to allow her to pass. She sighed, a quick sigh of disappointment. His pride in her beauty had been in direct conflict, and his pride had remained the conqueror. Perhaps, after all, she had been deceived just now. What she took to be the light of love in his eyes might only have been the passion of pride, or, who knows, of hatred instead of love. She stood looking at him for a moment or two longer. He was again as rigid, as impassive as before. Pride had conquered, and he cared not for her. The gray of dawn was gradually yielding to the rosy light of the rising sun. Birds began to twitter. Nature awakened, smiling in happy response to the warmth of this glorious October morning. Only between these two hearts there lay a strong, impassable barrier, built up of pride on both sides, which neither of them cared to be the first to demolish. He had bent his tall figure in a low, ceremonious bow, as she finally, with another bitter little sigh, began to mount the terrace steps. The long train of her gold-embroidered gown swept the dead leaves off the steps, making a faint, harmonious SH as she glided up, with one hand resting on the balustrade, the rosy light of dawn making an aureole of gold round her hair, and causing the rubies on her head and arms to sparkle. She reached the tall glass doors which led into the house. Before entering, she paused once again to look at him, hoping against hope to see his arms stretched out to her, and to hear his voice calling her back. But he had not moved. His massive figure looked the very personification of unbending pride, of fierce obstinacy. Hot tears again surged to her eyes, and as she would not let him see them, she turned quickly within, and ran as fast as she could up to her own rooms. Had she but turned back then, and looked out once more on to the rose-lit garden, she would have seen that which would have made her own suffering seem but light and easy to bear. A strong man, overwhelmed with his own passion and his own despair. Pride had given way at last. Obstinacy was gone. The will was powerless. He was but a man madly, blindly, passionately in love, and as soon as her light footsteps had died away within the house, he knelt down upon the terrace steps, and in the very madness of his love, he kissed one by one the places where her small foot had trodden and the stone balustrade there, where her tiny hand had rested last. Chapter 17. Farewell. When Marguerite reached her room, she found her maid terribly anxious about her. "Your ladyship will be so tired," said the poor woman, whose own eyes were half closed with sleep. "It is past 5 o'clock. "Ah, yes, Louise, I dare say I shall be tired presently," said Marguerite, kindly, "but you are very tired now, so go to bed at once." "I'll get into bed alone." "But, my lady—" "Now, don't argue, Louise, but go to bed. Give me a wrap, and leave me alone." Louise was only too glad to obey. She took off her mistress's gorgeous ball dress, and wrapped her up in a soft, billowy gown. "Does your ladyship wish for anything else?" she asked when that was done. "No, nothing more. Put out the lights as you go out." "Yes, my lady." "Good night, my lady." "Good night, Louise." When the maid was gone, Marguerite drew aside the curtains and threw open the windows. The garden and the river beyond were flooded with rosy light. Far away to the east, the rays of the rising sun had changed the rose into vivid gold. The lawn was deserted now, and Marguerite looked down upon the terrace where she had stood a few moments ago, trying vainly to win back a man's love, which once had been so wholly hers. It was strange that through all her troubles, all her anxiety for Armand, She was mostly conscious at the present moment of a keen and bitter heartache. Her very limbs seemed to ache with longing for the love of a man who had spurned her, who had resisted her tenderness, remained cold to her appeals, and had not responded to the glow of passion, which had caused her to feel and hope that those happy olden days in Paris were not all dead and forgotten. How strange it all was! She loved him still, and now that she looked back upon the last few months of misunderstandings and of loneliness, she realized that she had never ceased to love him, that deep down in her heart she had always vaguely felt that his foolish inanities, his empty laugh, his lazy nonchalance were nothing but a mask, that the real man, strong, passionate, willful, was there still, the man she had loved, whose intensity had fascinated her, whose personality attracted her, since she always felt that behind his apparently slow wits there was a certain something which he kept hidden from all the world, and most especially from her. A woman's heart is such a complex problem. The owner thereof is often most incompetent to find the solution of this puzzle. Did Marguerite Blakeney, the cleverest woman in Europe, really love a fool? Was it love that she had felt for him a year ago when she married him? Was it love she felt for him now that she realized that he still loved her, but that he would not become her slave, her passionate, ardent lover once again? Nay, Marguerite herself could not have told that. Not at this moment, at any rate. Perhaps her pride had sealed her mind against a better understanding of her own heart. But this she did know, that she meant to capture that obstinate heart back again, that she would conquer once more, and then that she would never lose him. She would keep him, keep his love, deserve it, and cherish it. For this much was certain, that there was no longer any happiness possible for her without that one man's love. Thus the most contradictory thoughts and emotions rushed madly through her mind. Absorbed in them, she had allowed time to slip by. Perhaps, tired out with long excitement, she had actually closed her eyes and sunk into a troubled sleep, wherein quickly fleeting dreams seemed but the continuation of her anxious thoughts, when suddenly she was roused, from dream or meditation, by the noise of footsteps outside her door. Nervously, she jumped up and listened. The house itself was as still as ever. The footsteps had retreated. Through her wide-open windows, the brilliant rays of the morning sun were flooding her room with light. She looked up at the clock. It was 6:30. Too early for any of the household to be already astir. She certainly must have dropped asleep, quite unconsciously. The noise of the footsteps, also of hushed, subdued voices, had awakened her. What could they be? Gently, on tiptoe, she crossed the room and opened the door to listen. Not a sound. That peculiar stillness of the early morning when sleep with all mankind is at its heaviest. But the noise had made her nervous, and when, suddenly, at her feet, on the very doorstep, she saw something white lying there, a letter evidently, she hardly dared touch it. It seemed so ghost-like. It certainly was not there when she came upstairs. Had Louise dropped it? Or was some tantalizing spook at play, showing her fairy letters where none existed? At last she stooped to pick it up, and amazed, puzzled beyond measure, she saw that the letter was addressed to herself in her husband's large, business-like-looking hand. What could he have to say to her, in the middle of the night, which could not be put off until the morning? She tore open the envelope and read, "A most unforeseen circumstance forces me to leave for the north immediately. So I beg your ladyship's pardon if I do not avail myself of the honor of bidding you goodbye. My business may keep me employed for about a week, so I shall not have the privilege of being present at your ladyship's water party on Wednesday. I remain your ladyship's most humble and most obedient servant, Percy Blakeney." Marguerite must suddenly have been imbued with her husband's slowness of intellect, for she had perforce to read the few simple lines over and over again, before she could fully grasp their meaning. She stood on the landing, turning over and over in her hand this curt and mysterious epistle, her mind a blank, her nerves strained with agitation and a presentiment she could not very well have explained. Sir Percy owned considerable property in the north, certainly, and he had often before gone there alone and stayed away a week at a time. But it seemed so very strange that circumstances should have arisen between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning that compelled him to start in this extreme hurry. Vainly she tried to shake off an unaccustomed feeling of nervousness. She was trembling from head to foot. A wild, unconquerable desire seized her to see her husband again, at once, if only he had not already started. Forgetting the fact that she was only very lightly clad in a morning wrap and that her hair lay loosely about her shoulders, she flew down the stairs, right through the hall towards the front door. It was as usual barred and bolted, for the indoor servants were not yet up. But her keen ears had detected the sound of voices and the pawing of a horse's hoof against the flagstones. With nervous, trembling fingers, Marguerite undid the bolts one by one, bruising her hands, hurting her nails, for the locks were heavy and stiff. But she did not care. Her whole frame shook with anxiety at the very thought that she might be too late, that he might have gone without her seeing him and bidding him Godspeed. At last, she had turned the key and thrown open the door. Her ears had not deceived her. A groom was standing close by holding a couple of horses. One of these was Sultan, Sir Percy's favorite and swiftest horse, saddled ready for a journey. The next moment Sir Percy himself appeared round the further corner of the house and came quickly towards the horses. He had changed his gorgeous ball costume, but was as usual irreproachably and richly apparelled in a suit of fine cloth, with lace jabot and ruffles, high top boots, and riding breeches. Marguerite went forward a few steps. He looked up and saw her. A slight frown appeared between his eyes. "You are going?" she said quickly and feverishly. "Whither?" "As I have had the honor of informing your ladyship, urgent, most unexpected business calls me to the north this morning," he said in his usual cold, drawling manner. "But your guest tomorrow. I have prayed your ladyship to offer my humble excuses to his royal highness. You are such a perfect hostess. I do not think that I shall be missed. But surely you might have waited for your journey until after our water party," she said, still speaking quickly and nervously. "Surely the business is not so urgent, and you said nothing about it just now." "My business, as I had the honor to tell you, madam, is as unexpected as it is urgent. May I therefore crave your permission to go? Can I do aught for you in town? On my way back?" "No, no. Thanks, nothing. But you will be back soon? Very soon? Before the end of the week?" "I cannot say." He was evidently trying to get away, while she was straining every nerve to keep him back for a moment or two. "Percy," she said, "will you not tell me why you go today? Surely I, as your wife, have the right to know. You have not been called away to the north." "I know it. There were no letters, no couriers from there before we left for the opera last night, and nothing was waiting for you when we returned from the ball. You are not going to the north, I feel convinced. There is some mystery, and—" "Nay, there is no mystery, madam," he replied, with a slight tone of impatience. "My business has to do with Armand. There, now, have I your leave to depart?" "With Armand? But you will run no danger." "Danger? I?" "Nay, madam, your solicitude does me honor. As you say, I have some influence. My intention is to exert it before it be too late. Will you allow me to thank you at least?" "Nay, madam," he said coldly, "there is no need for that. My life is at your service, and I am already more than repaid. And mine will be at yours, Sir Percy, if you will but accept it in exchange for what you do for Armand," she said as, impulsively, she stretched out both her hands to him. "There! I will not detain you. My thoughts go with you. Farewell." How lovely she looked in this morning sunlight, with her ardent hair streaming around her shoulders. He bowed very low and kissed her hand. She felt the burning kiss, and her heart thrilled with joy and hope. "You will come back?" she said tenderly. "Very soon," he replied, looking longingly into her blue eyes. "And you will remember?" she asked as her eyes, in response to his look, gave him an infinity of promise. "I will always remember, madam, that you have honored me by commanding my services." The words were cold and formal, but they did not chill her this time. Her woman's heart had read his, beneath the impassive mask his pride still forced him to wear. He bowed to her again, then begged her leave to depart. She stood on one side whilst he jumped onto Sultan's back. Then, as he galloped out of the gates, she waved him a final adieu. A bend in the road soon hid him from view. His confidential groom had some difficulty in keeping pace with him, for Sultan flew along in response to his master's excited mood. Marguerite, with a sigh that was almost a happy one, turned and went within. She went back to her room, for suddenly, like a tired child, she felt quite sleepy. Her heart seemed all at once to be in complete peace, and, though it still ached with undefined longing, a vague and delicious hope soothed it as with a balm. She felt no longer anxious about Armand. The man who had just ridden away, bent on helping her brother, inspired her with complete confidence in his strength and in his power. She marveled at herself for having ever looked upon him as an inane fool. Of course, that was a mask worn to hide the bitter wound she had dealt to his faith and to his love. His passion would have overmastered him, and he would not let her see how much he still cared and how deeply he suffered. But now all would be well. She would crush her own pride, humble it before him, tell him everything, trust him in everything. And those happy days would come back when they used to wander off together in the forest of Fontainebleau, when they spoke little, for he was always a silent man. But when she felt that against that strong heart, she would always find rest and happiness. The more she thought of the events of the past night, the less fear had she of Chauvelin and his schemes. He had failed to discover the identity of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Of that she felt sure. Both Lord Fancourt and Chauvelin himself had assured her that no one had been in the dining room at 1 o'clock except the Frenchman himself and Percy. Yes, Percy. She might have asked him, had she thought of it? Anyway, she had no fears that the unknown and brave hero would fall in Chauvelin's trap. His death at any rate would not be at her door. Armand certainly was still in danger, but Percy had pledged his word that Armand would be safe. And somehow, as Marguerite had seen him riding away, the possibility that he could fail in whatever he undertook never even remotely crossed her mind. When Armand was safely over in England, she would not allow him to go back to France. She felt almost happy now, and, drawing the curtains closely together again to shut out the piercing sun, she went to bed at last, laid her head upon the pillow, and, like a wearied child, soon fell into a peaceful and dreamless sleep. Chapter 18. The Mysterious Device. The day was well advanced when Marguerite woke, refreshed by her long sleep. Louise had brought her some fresh milk and a dish of fruit, and she partook of this frugal breakfast with hearty appetite. Thoughts crowded thick and fast in her mind as she munched her grapes. Most of them went galloping away after the tall, erect figure of her husband, whom she had watched riding out of sight more than 5 hours ago. In answer to her eager inquiries, Louise brought back the news that the groom had come home with Sultan, having left Sir Percy in London. The groom thought that his master was about to get on board his schooner, which was lying off just below London Bridge. Sir Percy had ridden thus far, had then met Briggs, the skipper of the Daydream, and had sent the groom back to Richmond with Sultan and the empty saddle. This news puzzled Marguerite more than ever. Where could Sir Percy be going just now in the Daydream? On Armand's behalf, he had said. Well, Sir Percy had influential friends everywhere. Perhaps he was going to Greenwich, but Marguerite ceased to conjecture. All would be explained anon. He said that he would come back, and that he would remember. A long, idle day lay before Marguerite. She was expecting the visit of her old schoolfellow, little Suzanne de Tournay. With all the merry mischief at her command, she had tendered her request for Suzanne's company to the Countess in the presence of the Prince of Wales last night. His Royal Highness had loudly applauded the notion, and declared that he would give himself the pleasure of calling on the two ladies in the course of the afternoon. The Countess had not dared to refuse, and there was entrapped into a promise to send little Suzanne to spend a long and happy day at Richmond with her friend. Marguerite expected her eagerly. She longed for a chat about old school days with the child. She felt that she would prefer Suzanne's company to that of anyone else, and together they would roam through the fine old garden and rich deer park, or stroll along the river. But Suzanne had not come yet, and Marguerite, being dressed, prepared to go downstairs. She looked quite a girl this morning in her simple muslin frock, with a broad blue sash round her slim waist, and the dainty crossover fichu into which, at her bosom, she had fastened a few late crimson roses. She crossed the landing outside her own suite of apartments, and stood still for a moment at the head of the fine oak staircase, which led to the lower floor. On her left were her husband's apartments, a suite of rooms which she practically never entered. They consisted of bedroom, dressing, and reception room, and at the extreme end of the landing, of a small study, which, when Sir Percy did not use it, was always kept locked. His own special and confidential valet, Frank, had charge of this room. No one was ever allowed to go inside. My lady had never cared to do so, and the other servants had, of course, not dared to break this hard and fast rule. Marguerite had often, with that good-natured contempt which she had recently adopted towards her husband, chaffed him about this secrecy which surrounded his private study. Laughingly, she had always declared that he strictly excluded all prying eyes from his sanctum for fear they should detect how very little study went on within its four walls. A comfortable armchair for Sir Percy's sweet slumbers was, no doubt, its most conspicuous piece of furniture. Marguerite thought of all this on this bright October morning as she glanced along the corridor. Frank was evidently busy with his master's rooms, for most of the doors stood open, that of the study amongst the others. A sudden, burning, childish curiosity seized her to have a peep at Sir Percy's sanctum. The restriction, of course, did not apply to her, and Frank would, of course, not dare to oppose her. Still, she hoped that the valet would be busy in one of the other rooms, that she might have that one quick peep in secret and unmolested. Gently, on tiptoe, she crossed the landing and, like Bluebeard's wife, trembling half with excitement and wonder, she paused a moment on the threshold, strangely perturbed and irresolute. The door was ajar, and she could not see anything within. She pushed it open tentatively. There was no sound. Frank was evidently not there, and she walked boldly in. At once she was struck by the severe simplicity of everything around her. The dark and heavy hangings, the massive oak furniture, the one or two maps on the wall, in no way recalled to her mind the lazy man about town, the lover of racecourses, the dandified leader of fashion, that was the outward representation of Sir Percy Blakeney. There was no sign here, at any rate, of hurried departure. Everything was in its place. Not a scrap of paper littered the floor. Not a cupboard or drawer was left open. The curtains were drawn aside, and through the open window the fresh morning air was streaming in. Facing the window, and well into the center of the room, stood a ponderous business-like desk, which looked as if it had seen much service. On the wall to the left of the desk, reaching almost from floor to ceiling, was a large full-length portrait of a woman, magnificently framed, exquisitely painted, and signed with the name of Boucher. It was Percy's mother. Marguerite knew very little about her, except that she had died abroad, ailing in body as well as in mind, when Percy was still a lad. She must have been a very beautiful woman once, when Boucher painted her, and as Marguerite looked at the portrait, she could not but be struck by the extraordinary resemblance which must have existed between mother and son. There was the same low, square forehead, crowned with thick, fair hair, smooth and heavy, the same deep-set, somewhat lazy blue eyes beneath firmly marked, straight brows, and in those eyes there was the same intensity behind that apparent laziness, the same latent passion which used to light up Percy's face in the olden days before his marriage, and which Marguerite had again noted last night at dawn, when she had come quite close to him, and had allowed a note of tenderness to creep into her voice. Marguerite studied the portrait, for it interested her. After that she turned and looked again at the ponderous desk. It was covered with a mass of papers, all neatly tied and docketed, which looked like accounts and receipts arrayed with perfect method. It had never before struck Marguerite, nor had she, alas, found it worthwhile to inquire, as to how Sir Percy, whom all the world had credited with a total lack of brains, administered the vast fortune which his father had left him. Since she had entered this neat, orderly room, she had been taken so much by surprise that this obvious proof of her husband's strong business capacities did not cause her more than a passing thought of wonder. But it also strengthened her in the now certain knowledge that, with his worldly inanities, his foppish ways, and foolish talk, he was not only wearing a mask, but was playing a deliberate and studied part. Marguerite wondered again. Why should he take all this trouble? Why should he, who was obviously a serious, earnest man, wished to appear before his fellow men as an empty-headed nincompoop? He may have wished to hide his love for a wife who held him in contempt, but surely such an object could have been gained at less sacrifice, and with far less trouble than constant incessant acting of an unnatural part. She looked round her quite aimlessly now. She was horribly puzzled, and a nameless dread before all this strange, unaccountable mystery had begun to seize upon her. She felt cold and uncomfortable suddenly in this severe and dark room. There were no pictures on the wall, save the fine Boucher portrait, only a couple of maps, both of parts of France, one of the north coast and the other of the environs of Paris. What did Sir Percy want with those, she wondered. Her head began to ache. She turned away from this strange blue beard's chamber, which she had entered, and which she did not understand. She did not wish Frank to find her here, and with a last look round, she once more turned to the door. As she did so, her foot knocked against a small object, which had apparently been lying close to the desk, on the carpet, and which now went rolling, right across the room. She stooped to pick it up. It was a solid gold ring, with a flat shield, on which was engraved a small device. Marguerite turned it over in her fingers, and then studied the engraving on the shield. It represented a small star-shaped flower, of a shape she had seen so distinctly twice before, once at the opera, and once at Lord Grenville's ball. Chapter 19. The Scarlet Pimpernel. At what particular moment the strange doubt first crept into Marguerite's mind, she could not herself afterwards have said. With the ring tightly clutched in her hand, she had run out of the room, down the stairs, and out into the garden, where, in complete seclusion, alone with the flowers and the river and the birds, she could look again at the ring and study that device more closely. Stupidly, senselessly, now, sitting beneath the shade of an overhanging sycamore, she was looking at the plain gold shield with the star-shaped little flower engraved upon it. Bah! It was ridiculous. She was dreaming. Her nerves were overwrought, and she saw signs and mysteries in the most trivial coincidences. Had not everybody about town recently made a point of affecting the device of that mysterious and heroic Scarlet Pimpernel? Did she not herself wear it embroidered on her gowns, set in gems and enamel in her hair? What was there strange in the fact that Sir Percy should have chosen to use the device as a seal ring? He might easily have done that. Yes, quite easily. And, besides, what connection could there be between her exquisite dandy of a husband, with his fine clothes and refined, lazy ways, and the daring plotter who rescued French victims from beneath the very eyes of the leaders of a bloodthirsty revolution? Her thoughts were in a whirl, her mind a blank. She did not see anything that was going on around her, and was quite startled when a fresh young voice called to her across the garden. "Sherry, Sherry, where are you?" And little Suzanne, fresh as a rosebud, with eyes dancing with glee and brown curls fluttering in the soft morning breeze, came running across the lawn. "They told me you were in the garden," she went on, prattling merrily and throwing herself with pretty, girlish impulse into Marguerite's arms, "so I ran out to give you a surprise." "You did not expect me quite so soon, did you, my darling little Margot Sherry?" Marguerite, who had hastily concealed the ring in the folds of her kerchief, tried to respond gaily and unconcernedly to the young girl's impulsiveness. "Indeed, sweet one," she said with a smile, "it is delightful to have you all to myself, and for a nice whole long day. You won't be bored?" "Oh, bored? Margot, how can you say such a wicked thing? Why, when we were in the dear old convent together, we were always happy when we were allowed to be alone together, and to talk secrets." The two young girls had linked their arms in one another's and began wandering round the garden. "Oh, how lovely your home is, Margot, darling," said little Suzanne enthusiastically, "and how happy you must be." Indeed, I ought to be happy." "Oughtn't I, sweet one?" said Marguerite, with a wistful little sigh. "How sadly you say it, Sherry. Ah, well, I suppose now that you are a married woman you won't care to talk secrets with me any longer." "Oh, what lots and lots of secrets we used to have at school. Do you remember? Some we did not even confide to Sister Teresa of the Holy Angels, though she was such a dear. And now you have one all-important secret, little one," said Marguerite, merrily, "which you are forthwith going to confide to me. Nay, you need not blush, Sherry. she added, as she saw Suzanne's pretty little face crimson with blushes. Faith, there's naught to be ashamed of. He is a noble and true man, and one to be proud of as a lover and as a husband. Indeed, Sherry, I am not ashamed, rejoined Suzanne softly, and it makes me very, very proud to hear you speak so well of him. I think Maman will consent, she added thoughtfully, and I shall be, so happy. But of course, nothing is to be thought of until Papa is safe. Marguerite started. Suzanne's father, the Comte de Tournay, one of those whose life would be jeopardized if Chauvelin succeeded in establishing the identity of the Scarlet Pimpernel. She had understood all along from the Countess, and also from one or two of the members of the League, that their mysterious leader had pledged his honor to bring the fugitive Comte de Tournay safely out of France. Whilst little Suzanne, unconscious of all, save her own all-important little secret, went prattling on, Marguerite's thoughts went back to the events of the past night. Armand's peril, Chauvelin's threat, his cruel either, or, which she had accepted. And then her own work in the matter, which should have culminated at 1 o'clock in Lord Grenville's dining room, when the relentless agent of the French government would finally learn who was this mysterious Scarlet Pimpernel, who so openly defied an army of spies and placed himself so boldly, and for mere sport, on the side of the enemies of France. Since then she had heard nothing from Chauvelin. She had concluded that he had failed, and yet she had not felt anxious about Armand, because her husband had promised her that Armand would be safe. But now, suddenly, as Suzanne prattled merrily along, an awful horror came upon her for what she had done. Chauvelin had told her nothing, it was true, but she remembered how sarcastic and evil he looked when she took final leave of him after the ball. Had he discovered something then? Had he already laid his plans for catching the daring plotter, red-handed, in France, and sending him to the guillotine without compunction or delay? Marguerite turned sick with horror, and her hand convulsively clutched the ring in her dress. "You are not listening, Sherry," said Suzanne, reproachfully, as she paused in her long, highly interesting narrative. "Yes, yes, darling. Indeed I am," said Marguerite with an effort, forcing herself to smile. "I love to hear you talking, and your happiness makes me so very glad. Have no fear. We will manage to propitiate Maman. Sir Andrew Ffoulkes is a noble English gentleman. He has money and position. The Countess will not refuse her consent. But now, little one, tell me, what is the latest news about your father?" "Oh," said Suzanne, with mad glee, "the best we could possibly hear. My Lord Hastings came to see Maman early this morning. He said that all is now well with dear Papa, and we may safely expect him here in England in less than 4 days." "Yes," said Marguerite, whose glowing eyes were fastened on Suzanne's lips, as she continued merrily. "Oh, we have no fear now. You don't know, Sherry, that great and noble Scarlet Pimpernel himself has gone to save Papa. He has gone, Sherry, actually gone," added Suzanne excitedly. "He was in London this morning. He will be in Calais perhaps tomorrow, where he will meet Papa, and then, the blow had fallen. She had expected it all along, though she had tried for the last half hour to delude herself and to cheat her fears. He had gone to Calais, had been in London this morning, the Scarlet Pimpernel. Percy Blakeney, her husband, whom she had betrayed last night to Chauvelin. Percy, her husband, the Scarlet Pimpernel. Oh! How could she have been so blind? She understood it now. All at once, that part he played, the mask he wore in order to throw dust in everybody's eyes. And all for sheer sport and devilry, of course. Saving men, women, and children from death, as other men destroy and kill animals for the excitement, the love of the thing. The idle, rich man wanted some aim in life. He, and the few young bucks he enrolled under his banner, had amused themselves for months in risking their lives for the sake of an innocent few. Perhaps he had meant to tell her when they were first married, and then the story of the Marquis de Saint-Cyr had come to his ears, and he had suddenly turned from her, thinking, no doubt, that she might some day betray him and his comrades, who had sworn to follow him. And so he had tricked her, as he tricked all others, whilst hundreds now owed their lives to him, and many families owed him both life and happiness. The mask of the inane fop had been a good one, and the part consummately well played. No wonder that Chauvelin's spies had failed to detect, in the apparently brainless nincompoop, the man whose reckless daring and resourceful ingenuity had baffled the keenest French spies, both in France and in England. Even last night, when Chauvelin went to Lord Grenville's dining room to seek that daring Scarlet Pimpernel, he only saw that inane Sir Percy Blakeney fast asleep in a corner of the sofa. Had his astute mind guessed the secret? Then, here lay the whole awful, horrible, amazing puzzle. In betraying a nameless stranger to his fate in order to save her brother, had Marguerite Blakeney sent her husband to his death? No, no, no. 1,000 times no. Surely fate could not deal a blow like that. Nature itself would rise in revolt. Her hand, when it held that tiny scrap of paper last night, would surely have been struck numb ere it committed a deed so appalling and so terrible. "But what is it, Sherry?" said little Suzanne, now genuinely alarmed, for Marguerite's color had become dull and ashen. "Are you ill, Marguerite? What is it?" "Nothing, nothing, child," she murmured, as in a dream. "Wait a moment, let me think. You said the Scarlet Pimpernel had gone today." "Marguerite, Sherry, what is it? You frighten me." "It is nothing, child, I tell you, nothing. I must be alone a minute. And, dear one, I may have to curtail our time together today. I may have to go away. You'll understand? I understand that something has happened, Sherry, and that you want to be alone. I won't be a hindrance to you. Don't think of me. My maid, Lucille, has not yet gone. We will go back together. Don't think of me." She threw her arms impulsively round Marguerite. Child as she was, she felt the poignancy of her friend's grief, and with the infinite tact of her girlish tenderness, she did not try to pry into it, but was ready to efface herself. She kissed Marguerite again and again, then walked sadly back across the lawn. Marguerite did not move. She remained there, thinking, wondering what was to be done. Just as little Suzanne was about to mount the terrace steps, a groom came running round the house towards his mistress. He carried a sealed letter in his hand. Suzanne instinctively turned back. Her heart told her that here perhaps was further ill news for her friend, and she felt that her poor Margot was not in a fit state to bear any more. The groom stood respectfully beside his mistress. Then he handed her the sealed letter. "What is that?" asked Marguerite. "Just come by runner, my lady." Marguerite took the letter mechanically and turned it over in her trembling fingers. "Who sent it?" she said. "The runner said, my lady," replied the groom, "that his orders were to deliver this, and that your ladyship would understand from whom it came." Marguerite tore open the envelope. Already her instinct had told her what it contained, and her eyes only glanced at it mechanically. It was a letter written by Armand St. Just to Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, the letter which Chauvelin's spies had stolen at the Fisherman's Rest, and which Chauvelin had held as a rod over her to enforce her obedience. Now he had kept his word. He had sent her back St. Just's compromising letter, for he was on the track of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Marguerite's senses reeled. Her very soul seemed to be leaving her body. She tottered, and would have fallen but for Suzanne's arm round her waist. With superhuman effort she regained control over herself. There was yet much to be done. "Bring that runner here to me," she said to the servant, with much calm. "He is not gone?" "No, my lady." The groom went, and Marguerite turned to Suzanne. "And you, child, run within. Tell Lucille to get ready. I fear I must send you home, child. And, stay, tell one of the maids to prepare a traveling dress and cloak for me." Suzanne made no reply. She kissed Marguerite tenderly, and obeyed without a word. The child was overawed by the terrible, nameless misery in her friend's face. A minute later the groom returned, followed by the runner who had brought the letter. "Who gave you this packet?" asked Marguerite. "A gentleman, my lady," replied the man, "at the Rose and Thistle in opposite Charing Cross. He said you would understand." "At the Rose and Thistle? What was he doing?" "He was waiting for the coach, your ladyship, which he had ordered." "The coach?" "Yes, my lady. A special coach he had ordered. I understood from his man that he was posting straight to Dover." "That's enough. You may go." Then she turned to the groom. "My coach and the 4 swiftest horses in the stables, to be ready at once." The groom and runner both went quickly off to obey. Marguerite remained standing for a moment on the lawn, quite alone. Her graceful figure was as rigid as a statue. Her eyes were fixed. Her hands were tightly clasped across her breast. Her lips moved as they murmured with pathetic, heartbreaking persistence. "What's to be done? What's to be done? Where to find him? Oh, God, grant me light." But this was not the moment for remorse and despair. She had done unwittingly an awful and terrible thing, the very worst crime, in her eyes, that woman ever committed. She saw it in all its horror. Her very blindness in not having guessed her husband's secret seemed now to her another deadly sin. She ought to have known. She ought to have known. How could she imagine that a man who could love with so much intensity as Percy Blakeney had loved her from the first? How could such a man be the brainless idiot he chose to appear? She, at least, ought to have known that he was wearing a mask, and having found that out, she should have torn it from his face whenever they were alone together. Her love for him had been paltry and weak, easily crushed by her own pride, and she, too, had worn a mask in assuming a contempt for him, whilst, as a matter of fact, she completely misunderstood him. But there was no time now to go over the past. By her own blindness she had sinned. Now she must repay, not by empty remorse, but by prompt and useful action. Percy had started for Calais, utterly unconscious of the fact that his most relentless enemy was on his heels. He had set sail early that morning from London Bridge. Provided he had a favorable wind, he would no doubt be in France within 24 hours. No doubt he had reckoned on the wind and chosen this route. Chauvelin, on the other hand, would post to Dover, charter a vessel there, and undoubtedly reach Calais much about the same time. Once in Calais, Percy would meet all those who were eagerly waiting for the noble and brave Scarlet Pimpernel, who had come to rescue them from horrible and unmerited death. With Chauvelin's eyes now fixed upon his every movement, Percy would thus not only be endangering his own life, but that of Suzanne's father, the old Comte de Tournay, and of those other fugitives who were waiting for him and trusting in him. There was also Armand, who had gone to meet de Tournay, secure in the knowledge that the Scarlet Pimpernel was watching over his safety. All these lives, and that of her husband, lay in Marguerite's hands. These she must save if human pluck and ingenuity were equal to the task. Unfortunately, she could not do all this quite alone. Once in Calais, she would not know where to find her husband, whilst Chauvelin, in stealing the papers at Dover, had obtained the whole itinerary. Above everything, she wished to warn Percy. She knew enough about him by now to understand that he would never abandon those who trusted in him, that he would not turn back from danger and leave the Comte de Tournay to fall into the bloodthirsty hands that knew of no mercy. But if he were warned, he might form new plans, be more wary, more prudent. Unconsciously, he might fall into a cunning trap, but, once warned, he might yet succeed. And if he failed, if indeed fate and Chauvelin, with all the resources at his command, proved too strong for the daring plotter after all, then at least she would be there by his side, to comfort, love, and cherish, to cheat death perhaps at the last by making it seem sweet, if they died both together, locked in each other's arms, with the supreme happiness of knowing that passion had responded to passion, and that all misunderstandings were at an end. Her whole body stiffened as with a great and firm resolution. This she meant to do, if God gave her wits and strength. Her eyes lost their fixed look. They glowed with inward fire at the thought of meeting him again so soon, in the very midst of most deadly perils. They sparkled with the joy of sharing these dangers with him, of helping him perhaps, of being with him at the last, if she failed. The childlike sweet face had become hard and set. The curved mouth was closed tightly over her clenched teeth. She meant to do or die, with him and for his sake. A frown, which spoke of an iron will and unbending resolution, appeared between the two straight brows. Already her plans were formed. She would go and find Sir Andrew Ffoulkes first. He was Percy's best friend, and Marguerite remembered with a thrill, with what blind enthusiasm the young man always spoke of his mysterious leader. He would help her where she needed help. Her coach was ready. A change of raiment, and a farewell to little Suzanne, and she could be on her way. Without haste, but without hesitation, she walked quietly into the house. Chapter 20. The Friend. Less than half an hour later, Marguerite, buried in thoughts, sat inside her coach, which was bearing her swiftly to London. She had taken an affectionate farewell of little Suzanne, and seen the child safely started with her maid, and in her own coach, back to town. She had sent one courier with a respectful letter of excuse to His Royal Highness, begging for a postponement of the August visit on account of pressing and urgent business, and another on ahead to bespeak a fresh relay of horses at Faversham. Then she had changed her muslin frock for a dark traveling costume and mantle, had provided herself with money, which her husband's lavishness always placed fully at her disposal, and had started on her way. She did not attempt to delude herself with any vain and futile hopes. The safety of her brother Armand was to have been conditional on the imminent capture of the Scarlet Pimpernel. As Chauvelin had sent her back Armand's compromising letter, there was no doubt that he was quite satisfied in his own mind that Percy Blakeney was the man whose death he had sworn to bring about. No, there was no room for any fond delusions. Percy, the husband whom she loved with all the ardor which her admiration for his bravery had kindled, was in immediate, deadly peril, through her hand. She had betrayed him to his enemy, unwittingly, 'tis true, but she had betrayed him, and if Chauvelin succeeded in trapping him, who so far was unaware of his danger, then his death would be at her door. His death, when with her very heart's blood, she would have defended him and given willingly her life for his. She had ordered her coach to drive her to the Crown Inn. Once there, she told her coachman to give the horses food and rest. Then she ordered a chair, and had herself carried to the house in Pall Mall where Sir Andrew Ffoulkes lived. Among all Percy's friends who were enrolled under his daring banner, she felt that she would prefer to confide in Sir Andrew Ffoulkes. He had always been her friend, and now his love for little Suzanne had brought him closer to her still. Had he been away from home, gone on the mad errand with Percy, perhaps, then she would have called on Lord Hastings or Lord Tony, for she wanted the help of one of these young men, or she would be indeed powerless to save her husband. Sir Andrew Ffoulkes, however, was at home, and his servant introduced her ladyship immediately. She went upstairs to the young man's comfortable bachelor's chambers, and was shown into a small, though luxuriously furnished dining room. A moment or two later Sir Andrew himself appeared. He had evidently been much startled when he heard who his lady visitor was, for he looked anxiously, even suspiciously, at Marguerite, whilst performing the elaborate bows before her, which the rigid etiquette of the time demanded. Marguerite had laid aside every vestige of nervousness. She was perfectly calm, and having returned the young man's elaborate salute, she began very calmly. "Sir Andrew, I have no desire to waste valuable time in much talk. You must take certain things I am going to tell you for granted. These will be of no importance. What is important is that your leader and comrade, the Scarlet Pimpernel, my husband, Percy Blakeney, is in deadly peril." Had she had the remotest doubt of the correctness of her deductions, she would have had them confirmed now, for Sir Andrew, completely taken by surprise, had grown very pale, and was quite incapable of making the slightest attempt at clever parrying. "No matter how I know this, Sir Andrew," she continued quietly, "thank God that I do, and that perhaps it is not too late to save him. Unfortunately, I cannot do this quite alone, and therefore have come to you for help." "Lady Blakeney," said the young man, trying to recover himself. "Will you hear me first?" she interrupted. "This is how the matter stands. When the agent of the French government stole your papers that night in Dover, he found amongst them certain plans, which you or your leader meant to carry out for the rescue of the Comte de Tournay and others. The Scarlet Pimpernel, Percy, my husband, has gone on this errand himself today. Chauvelin knows that the Scarlet Pimpernel and Percy Blakeney are one and the same person. He will follow him to Calais, and they will lay hands on him. You know as well as I do the fate that awaits him at the hands of the revolutionary government of France. No interference from England, from King George himself, would save him. Robespierre and his gang would see to it that the interference came too late. But not only that, the much-trusted leader will also have been unconsciously the means of revealing the hiding place of the Comte de Tournay and of all those who, even now, are placing their hopes in him." She had spoken quietly, dispassionately, and with firm, unbending resolution. Her purpose was to make that young man trust and help her, for she could do nothing without him. I do not understand, he repeated, trying to gain time to think what was best to be done. But I think you do, Sir Andrew. You must know that I am speaking the truth. Look these facts straight in the face. Percy has sailed for Calais, I presume for some lonely part of the coast, and Chauvelin is on his track. He has posted for Dover, and will cross the channel probably tonight. What do you think will happen? The young man was silent. Percy will arrive at his destination. Unconscious of being followed, he will seek out de Tournay and the others. Among these is Armand St. Just my brother. He will seek them out, one after another, probably not knowing that the sharpest eyes in the world are watching his every movement. When he has thus unconsciously betrayed those who blindly trust in him, when nothing can be gained from him, and he is ready to come back to England, with those whom he has gone so bravely to save, the doors of the trap will close upon him, and he will be sent to end his noble life upon the guillotine. Still Sir Andrew was silent. You do not trust me, she said passionately. Oh God, cannot you see that I am in deadly earnest? Man, she added while, with her tiny hand, she seized the young man suddenly by the shoulders, forcing him to look straight at her. Tell me, do I look like that vilest thing on earth? A woman who would betray her own husband? God forbid, Lady Blakeney, said the young man at last, that I should attribute such evil motives to you. But what? Tell me. Quick, man. The very seconds are precious. Will you tell me? He asked resolutely, and looking searchingly into her blue eyes, whose hand helped to guide him, Chauvelin, to the knowledge which you say he possesses. Mine, she said quietly. I own it. I will not lie to you, for I wish you to trust me absolutely. But I had no idea. How could I have? Of the identity of the Scarlet Pimpernel, and my brother's safety was to be my prize if I succeeded. In helping Chauvelin to track the Scarlet Pimpernels? She nodded. It is no use telling you how he forced my hand. Armand is more than a brother to me, and how could I guess? But we waste time, Sir Andrew. Every second is precious. In the name of God. My husband is in peril, your friend, your comrade. Help me to save him. Sir Andrew felt his position to be a very awkward one. The oath he had taken before his leader and comrade was one of obedience and secrecy, and yet the beautiful woman, who was asking him to trust her, was undoubtedly in earnest. His friend and leader was equally undoubtedly in imminent danger and, Lady Blakeney, he said at last, God knows you have perplexed me, so that I do not know which way my duty lies. Tell me what you wish me to do. There are 19 of us ready to lay down our lives for the Scarlet Pimpernel if he is in danger. There is no need for lives just now, my friend, she said drily. My wits and 4 swift horses will serve the necessary purpose. But I must know where to find him. See, she added, while her eyes filled with tears, I have humbled myself before you. I have owned my fault to you. Shall I also confess my weakness? My husband and I have been estranged because he did not trust me, and because I was too blind to understand. You must confess that the bandage which he put over my eyes was a very thick one. Is it small wonder that I did not see through it? But last night, after I led him unwittingly into such deadly peril, it suddenly fell from my eyes. If you will not help me, Sir Andrew, I would still strive to save my husband. I would still exert every faculty I possess for his sake. But I might be powerless, for I might arrive too late, and nothing would be left for you but lifelong remorse. And, for me, a broken heart. But, Lady Blakeney, said the young man, touched by the gentle earnestness of this exquisitely beautiful woman, do you know that what you propose doing is man's work? You cannot possibly journey to Calais alone. You would be running the greatest possible risks to yourself, and your chances of finding your husband now, were I to direct you ever so carefully, are infinitely remote. Oh, I hope there are risks, she murmured softly. I hope there are dangers, too. I have so much to atone for. But I fear you are mistaken. Chauvelin's eyes are fixed upon you all. He will scarce notice me. Quick, Sir Andrew! The coach is ready, and there is not a moment to be lost. I must get to him. I must, she repeated with almost savage energy, to warn him that that man is on his track. Can't you see? Can't you see that I must get to him, even if it be too late to save him, at least to be by his side at the last? Faith, madam, you must command me. Gladly would I, or any of my comrades, lay down our lives for your husband. If you will go yourself? Nay, friend, do you not see that I would go mad if I let you go without me? She stretched out her hand to him. You will trust me? I await your orders, he said simply. Listen then, my coach is ready to take me to Dover. Do you follow me, as swiftly as horses will take you? We meet at nightfall at the Fisherman's Rest. Chauvelin would avoid it, as he is known there, and I think it would be the safest. I will gladly accept your escort to Calais. As you say, I might miss Sir Percy were you to direct me ever so carefully. We'll charter a schooner at Dover and cross over during the night. Disguise, if you will agree to it, as my lackey, you will, I think, escape detection. I am entirely at your service, madam, rejoined the young man earnestly. I trust to God that you will sight the day dream before we reach Calais. With Chauvelin at his heels, every step the Scarlet Pimpernel takes on French soil is fraught with danger. God grant it, Sir Andrew. But now, farewell. We meet tonight at Dover. It will be a race between Chauvelin and me across the channel tonight. And the prize, the life of the Scarlet Pimpernel. He kissed her hand and then escorted her to her chair. A quarter of an hour later, she was back at the Crown Inn, where her coach and horses were ready and waiting for her. The next moment, they thundered along the London streets, and then straight on to the Dover road at maddening speed. She had no time for despair now. She was up and doing, and had no leisure to think. With Sir Andrew Ffoulkes as her companion and ally, hope had once again revived in her heart. God would be merciful. He would not allow so appalling a crime to be committed as the death of a brave man through the hand of a woman who loved him and worshipped him, and who would gladly have died for his sake. Marguerite's thoughts flew back to him, the mysterious hero whom she had always unconsciously loved when his identity was still unknown to her. Laughingly, in the olden days, she used to call him the shadowy king of her heart. And now she had suddenly found that this enigmatic personality whom she had worshipped and the man who loved her so passionately were one and the same. What wonder that one or two happier visions began to force their way before her mind. She vaguely wondered what she would say to him when first they would stand face to face. She had had so many anxieties, so much excitement during the past few hours, that she allowed herself the luxury of nursing these few more hopeful, brighter thoughts. Gradually, the rumble of the coach wheels, with its incessant monotony, acted soothingly on her nerves. Her eyes, aching with fatigue and many shed and unshed tears, closed involuntarily, and she fell into a troubled sleep.